When a homeless veteran served 15 bikers in full leather-free meals at his roadside soup kitchen, nobody expected 888 bikers to show up 2 weeks later and shock the entire town. But that's exactly what happened in the small town of Ridgemont, Arizona. Marcus Williams didn't look like much anymore. At 62 years old, with a prosthetic leg that clicked when he walked and hands that shook every morning until the coffee kicked in, he was a far cry from the Marine Corps medic who'd pulled wounded men from rice paddies in Vietnam. They'd called him Doc back then, and the name had stuck even through the decades that followed, even through the drinking, the divorces, the jobs lost, the years sleeping in his car, and finally, the 7 years on the streets of Phoenix before he ended up here in Ridgemont. The soup kitchen wasn't much to look at. It was a converted storage unit behind an abandoned Texaco station on Route 47, the kind of place people drove past without a second glance. The storage unit was 10 feet by 20 feet, with a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, a hot plate Doc had bought at a thrift store for $8, and a folding table he'd pulled from a dumpster behind the high school. On good days, he had electricity. On bad days, he served cold sandwiches and apologized. But it was his, or at least it had been his for the past 18 months, ever since the property owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who lived in Tucson, had told him he could use it rent-free as long as he kept it clean. She'd lost a son in Desert Storm, she'd told him. She understood what it meant to serve. Doc served breakfast and dinner 6 days a week. On Sundays, he rested, though resting meant sitting on the curb outside and watching the highway, thinking about the men he'd saved and the ones he couldn't. He served anyone who showed up hungry, homeless folks from the encampment by the river, day laborers who couldn't afford both food and rent, kids whose parents worked 3 jobs and still came up short, old folks whose Social Security didn't stretch far enough. He never asked questions, never judged, never turned anyone away. The food came from wherever he could get it. The Baptist church used to bring him day-old bread on Wednesdays until 6 months ago. The grocery store donated dented cans and bruised produce until 3 months ago. Mostly now, it came from Doc's own pocket, funded by collecting aluminum cans along the highway, doing odd jobs when his leg allowed it, and stretching his veteran's disability check until it screamed. On a good day, he served 40 people. On a bad day, 20. He made it work with rice, beans, whatever vegetables he could afford, and the occasional donated meat that hadn't gone bad yet. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, it was filling, and it was given with dignity. Doc never made anyone feel like charity. He made them feel like guests. The trouble had started 8 months ago when Ridgemont's town council decided they needed to revitalize downtown. Ridgemont was a town of 4,200 people, the kind of place with 1 stoplight, 2 churches, and 3 bars. It sat along a stretch of highway that tourists used to pass through on their way to somewhere more interesting. The council wanted to change that. They wanted to attract those tourists, get them to stop, spend money, maybe even stay. Doc's soup kitchen didn't fit that vision. The first complaint came from Councilman Richard Brennan, who owned the auto parts store 3 blocks away. He'd shown up one Tuesday morning while Doc was serving breakfast, his face red, his tie too tight, his voice too loud. "You're bringing down property values," Brennan had said. "You're attracting criminals and drug addicts. You're making this town look bad." Doc had stayed calm. "These are human beings," he'd said. "They're hungry. I'm feeding them. That's all." But Brennan hadn't listened. None of them had. The complaints piled up. The town council held meetings. They sent the health inspector, who found violations that had never existed before. They sent the zoning officer, who discovered the storage unit wasn't properly permitted for food service. They sent the fire marshal, who declared the electrical wiring unsafe. Doc tried to fix everything they cited. He borrowed money he couldn't pay back. He worked 20-hour days. He passed every re-inspection, but it didn't matter. They just found something else wrong. Then came the eviction notice, served by a sheriff's deputy who wouldn't meet Doc's eyes. 30 days to vacate the premises. Failure to maintain proper permits, violation of the health and safety codes, unauthorized use of commercial property. The words blurred together, but the meaning was clear. They wanted him gone. Doc had tried everything. He'd gone to the town council meetings, stood at the podium during public comment, explained what he was doing and why. He'd been polite, respectful, pleading, They'd listened with fake sympathy and voted against him anyway, 5-0, every single time. He'd gone to the churches. The Baptist church said their hands were tied, the council had pressured them. The Methodist church said they were praying for him but couldn't help directly. The Catholic Church didn't return his calls. He'd tried to hire a lawyer, but lawyers cost money Doc didn't have. The legal aid office said it wasn't their jurisdiction. The ACLU said they couldn't take the case. The veterans organization said they'd send thoughts and prayers, which didn't stop eviction notices. Doc was alone. One man with a prosthetic leg and a soup kitchen against a town council, backed by business owners who wanted him invisible. He didn't have money, didn't have power, didn't have connections. All he had was the belief that hungry people deserved to eat, and that was about to cost him everything. The churches that had supported him stopped their donations after the council made it clear there would be consequences. The grocery store that had given him damaged goods suddenly had nothing to spare. The Baptist church ladies who used to help serve meals stopped coming, embarrassed, apologetic, afraid. His food supplier, a small distributor out of Flagstaff called Martinez Brothers Foods, had been his last reliable source. Old man Martinez was a veteran himself, Korea, and he'd been giving Doc wholesale prices and sometimes just giving him food outright. But 2 weeks ago, Martinez had called with bad news delivered in a voice thick with regret. The town council had threatened his business license, made phone calls, asked questions about his permits and inspections. Martinez had a family to feed, employees depending on him. "I'm sorry, Doc," he'd said. "I can't risk it. You understand." Doc had understood. He had understood that he was being systematically cut off from every source of support, every connection, every lifeline. He'd understood that the town council wasn't just trying to shut down his soup kitchen. They were trying to erase him entirely, to make him and everyone he served disappear, so Ridgemont could look pretty for tourists who might never come. The eviction date was set for the 1st of November, 2 weeks away. Doc had nowhere to go and no way to fight back. He'd served his country for 4 years, earned a Purple Heart and a prosthetic leg, come home to a nation that forgot about him the moment the war ended. He'd survived all of that, pulled himself up from 7 years of homelessness, and now he was about to lose the one thing that gave his life meaning. At night, lying on his cot in the corner of the storage unit, Doc stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was it, if this was how his story ended. Not with a bang, not with honor, but with a bureaucratic eviction notice and a padlock on a storage unit door. He thought about the people who depended on him. Maria, who was 73 and living on $400 a month. Tommy, who was 19 and sleeping in his car while working construction. The Johnson family, parents and 3 kids, staying at the motel when they could afford it and in their van when they couldn't. All the faces that showed up day after day, trusting that Doc would be there, that there would be food, that someone still cared. What would happen to them when he was gone? Who would feed them? The town council didn't care. The business owners didn't care. The churches had proven they wouldn't risk themselves to help. Doc was the last line, and that line was about to break. He'd made a promise to himself 18 months ago when Mrs. Chen gave him this space. He'd promised that as long as he had breath in his body and food in his hands, he would serve anyone who showed up hungry. He'd promised that he would be the person he'd needed when he was on the streets, the person who showed up without judgment and said, "You matter, you deserve to eat, you deserve dignity." Now that promise was being taken from him, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. The storage unit felt smaller every day. The walls seemed to be closing in. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered more often, as if even the electricity knew it was temporary. Doc's supplies dwindled. He had enough rice and beans to last maybe another week if he stretched it. Enough canned vegetables for 5 more days. After that, nothing. He couldn't afford a lawyer, couldn't fight City Hall, couldn't even afford to move somewhere else and start over. His disability check barely covered food for the kitchen, let alone first and last month's rent somewhere new. His truck was 23 years old and held together with duct tape and hope. His savings account had exactly $47 in it. Doc was beaten, and he knew it. The town council had won. They'd done it legally, properly, with all the right paperwork and procedures. They'd made him a problem that needed solving, and they'd solved it. In 2 weeks, he'd be gone, and Ridgemont could move forward with its revitalization plans without the embarrassment of a homeless veteran feeding homeless people on what was supposed to become a tourist-friendly, historic highway route. He thought about giving up, about just packing his few belongings, getting in his truck, and driving away before the eviction date. Maybe it would be easier that way, less humiliating. He could find another town, another abandoned space, start over somewhere else, but the thought of leaving felt like failure, like abandoning the people who needed him, like breaking the promise he'd made to himself and to every person who'd ever showed up hungry at his door. So Doc kept going. He served breakfast, he served dinner, he smiled at people who had less than he did and told them it would be okay, even though he didn't believe it anymore. He collected cans along the highway, his prosthetic leg aching with every step, and turned them in for pennies. He made sandwiches with the last of his bread and gave them away to people who needed them more. And he waited for the eviction date, knowing it was coming, knowing he couldn't stop it, knowing that in 2 weeks everything he'd built would be gone, and there was nothing he could do but watch it happen. Doc thought it couldn't get worse. He was wrong. The emergency town council meeting happened on a Thursday evening, and Doc only found out about it because Mrs. Patterson from the library called to warn him. "They're moving up your eviction," she'd whispered into the phone, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry, Doc. They voted. You have 7 days. 7 days, not 2 weeks. 7 days." Doc had stood in the phone booth outside the abandoned gas station, receiver pressed to his ear, and felt something inside him crack. "Why?" he'd asked. "What changed?" Mrs. Patterson had explained it quickly, nervously, like she was afraid of being caught. The state tourism board was coming to evaluate Ridgemont for their Community Beautification Award. The award came with $50,000 in grant money and official state recognition that the town council believed would attract tourists and business investments. The evaluation was scheduled for the first week of November, and the evaluators would be driving along Route 47, right past the abandoned gas station, right past Doc's soup kitchen. The council wanted him gone before the evaluators arrived. They wanted the homeless people gone. They wanted every trace of poverty and struggle erased from view so Ridgemont could look like a perfect little Arizona town worth investing in. Doc was a problem to be solved before the inspection, and they just moved up the deadline. Councilman Brennan had stood up during the meeting, Mrs. Patterson said, and argued that waiting 2 more weeks was unacceptable. He'd called Doc's operation an eyesore and a health hazard. He'd said the homeless encampment by the river was growing because Doc was attracting undesirables from other towns. He'd said that if the tourism board saw what was happening on Route 47, Ridgemont would lose the award and the money and any chance of economic revival. The vote had been unanimous, 5-0, 7 days. Doc had thanked Mrs. Patterson and hung up. He'd walked back to the storage unit in the dark, his prosthetic leg clicking against the pavement, and sat on his cot staring at the walls. 7 days to pack up 18 months of work. 7 days before he'd have nowhere to go and no way to help anyone. But it got worse. The next morning, Doc arrived at the storage unit to find 2 men in black uniforms standing near the entrance. Private security, their patches said, from a company called Sentinel Protection Services out of Phoenix. They weren't police, weren't sheriff's deputies, just hired muscle with badges that meant nothing but looked official enough to intimidate. One of them, a thick-necked man with mirror sunglasses, stepped forward as Doc approached. "This area is under observation," he said. "We're monitoring for trespassing and vagrancy." Doc had stopped, confused. "I have permission to be here. This is my kitchen." The guard had shrugged. "We're just doing our job, sir. The town council hired us to maintain security in this area during the transition period." What that meant, Doc realized over the next few days, was harassment. The guards didn't stop him from entering the storage unit, but they stopped everyone else. They checked IDs, asked questions, stood too close, made people uncomfortable. They wrote down license plate numbers, they took photographs. They made it clear that anyone who came for a meal was being watched, documented, recorded. The number of people showing up dropped immediately. Maria stopped coming. Tommy stopped coming. The Johnson family stopped coming. People were afraid. They were already vulnerable, already struggling. and the last thing they needed was to be photographed and questioned by men in uniforms who looked like cops, but weren't. Doc tried to complain to the sheriff's office, but the deputy he spoke to had been sympathetic and useless. "They're on private property," the deputy had explained. "The town council has authorization from the property owner. If they're not breaking any laws, there's nothing we can do." By Monday, Doc was serving maybe 10 people a day instead of 40. By Tuesday, it was down to 6. The security guards stood there watching, arms crossed, sunglasses reflecting the Arizona sun, and Doc felt like he was running a soup kitchen in a prison yard. Then came Wednesday, and Martinez Brothers Foods called. Doc had been expecting it, dreading it, but hoping somehow it wouldn't happen. Martinez's voice was tight with regret. "Doc, I can't do it anymore. The town council sent an inspector to my warehouse. They found violations I've had for years that nobody ever cared about before. They're threatening to shut me down if I keep supplying you." Doc had closed his eyes, phone pressed to his ear, and nodded even though Martinez couldn't see him. "I understand," he'd said. "I'm sorry they're doing this to you." "I'm sorry I can't help," Martinez had said. "You're a good man, Doc, better than most. But I got 12 employees and their families depending on me. I can't lose my business." After he hung up, Doc had checked his supplies. He had enough rice for maybe 3 more days, enough beans for 2, a dozen cans of vegetables, 5 loaves of bread that were already going stale. After that, nothing. No money to buy more. No supplier willing to risk helping him. No donations coming in. He was running a soup kitchen with no food and no way to get any. Thursday morning, Doc woke up before dawn and started walking the highway, collecting cans. His prosthetic leg ached after the first mile, screamed after the second, but he kept going. By noon, he had 3 garbage bags full of aluminum cans. He drove them to the recycling center in his wheezing pickup truck and got $32.15. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But Doc took that money and went to the dollar store and bought rice, beans, and bread. Enough for maybe 2 more days if he stretched it, enough to keep going just a little bit longer. Friday afternoon, while Doc was out collecting more cans, trying to scrape together enough money for 1 more shopping trip, the final blow landed. He'd been walking along Route 47, garbage bag slung over his shoulder, when he saw the truck pull up to the abandoned gas station. It was Mrs. Chen's son, David, who managed the property for her. Doc had met him twice, both times pleasant conversations about keeping the place maintained. This conversation wasn't pleasant. David Chen had stepped out of his truck looking uncomfortable, holding a piece of paper that Doc recognized immediately as a legal document. "Doc, I'm sorry," David had said. "The town council contacted my mother. They explained the situation with the permits and the health violations and the eviction order. They told her she could be held liable if anything happens on her property. She's 87 years old, Doc. She can't handle legal trouble." Doc had felt his chest tighten. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I have to padlock the storage unit. Today. Right now." David had looked genuinely sorry, but sorry didn't change anything. "You can get your personal belongings, but the equipment has to stay. It's technically property of the estate since it was here when we agreed to let you use the space." "But I have dinner service in 3 hours," Doc had said. "People are counting on me." "I'm sorry," David had repeated, and he'd pulled out a padlock from his pocket. Doc had stood there on the side of the highway, garbage bag full of cans in his hand, and watched David Chen padlock the storage unit. Inside was everything Doc owned: his hot plate, his folding table, his cot, the plastic bins where he stored rice and beans, his father's Purple Heart, the only thing he had left from the man who'd raised him, the only connection to a past where he'd been someone's son instead of someone's problem. All of it locked away. David had offered to let Doc grab his personal items, but Doc had just shaken his head. "It doesn't matter," he'd said quietly. "Without the kitchen, none of it matters." After David drove away, Doc had sat down on the curb outside the abandoned gas station and stared at the padlocked door. Everything he'd built, gone. 18 months of work, erased, the promise he'd made to himself, broken not by his own choice but by a town council that valued appearance over compassion. He'd sat there for an hour, maybe 2, watching the sun move across the sky, feeling the weight of defeat settle into his bones. The security guards had packed up and left, their job done, the threat eliminated. Cars drove past on Route 47 without slowing down, without noticing the old veteran sitting on a curb with nothing left. Doc thought about getting in his truck and driving away, thought about finding a bridge somewhere and just sleeping under it like he'd done for 7 years before this. Thought about giving up entirely, because what was the point of fighting when the fight was already lost? Then he remembered the sandwiches. That morning, before he'd left to collect cans, Doc had made 15 sandwiches with the last of his bread, peanut butter, and jelly. He'd wrapped them in plastic bags and put them in his cooler in the truck, planning to hand them out during dinner service. They were still there, sitting in the truck bed, the last meal he'd ever make from his soup kitchen. Doc pushed himself up from the curb, his prosthetic leg protesting, and walked to his truck. He pulled out the cooler, set it on the curb, and waited. If people showed up for dinner, at least he'd have something to give them. Not much, not hot, not what they deserved, but something. One last act of service before it all ended. At 5:30, a motorcycle rumbled up Route 47, then another. Then 13 more. 15 bikes total, loud and chrome shining in the late afternoon sun, pulling into the abandoned gas station parking lot in formation. The riders wore leather cuts, patches identifying them as the Iron Brotherhood MC, with a chapter designation from New Mexico. They parked their bikes and dismounted, stretching road-weary muscles, and that's when they noticed Doc sitting on the curb with his cooler. The road captain approached first. She was a tall woman, maybe 45, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a braid and a scar running along her jawline. Her cut identified her as Reaper. She looked at Doc, then at the padlocked storage unit, then back at Doc. "You serving food?" she asked. Doc had managed a tired smile. "I've got 15 sandwiches, peanut butter and jelly." "It's not much, but you're welcome to them." Reaper had studied him for a long moment, then called to her club. "Brothers, sisters, we got a veteran here offering us food. Let's show some respect." The Iron Brotherhood had gathered around as Doc handed out the sandwiches. They'd thanked him genuinely, eating standing up in the parking lot, and then Reaper had asked the question that changed everything. "What's your story, brother?" Doc had told them, not because he expected anything, not because he thought they could help, but because sometimes you just need to tell someone. He'd told them about the soup kitchen, about the town council, about the eviction, and the security guards, and the padlock, and the beautification award. He'd told them about serving his country and coming home to nothing and spending 7 years homeless before finally finding a purpose again. He'd told them about the 40 people a day who used to come for meals and the promise he'd made to keep serving as long as he could, and now he couldn't anymore. The Iron Brotherhood had listened in silence. When Doc finished, Reaper had nodded slowly, her expression hard. "You served in Vietnam?" "2 tours, Doc had said. "Combat medic. Earned this," and he gestured to his prosthetic leg. Reaper had looked at her club and something had passed between them, some unspoken communication that came from years of riding together. Then she'd turned back to Doc. "Brother, you gave us food when you had nothing. That means something. That means everything." She'd pulled out her phone and walked a few steps away, making a call. Doc had watched her talk, animated, urgent, her free hand gesturing as she spoke. The other Iron Brotherhood members had stayed with Doc, asking questions, sharing their own stories, treating him like he mattered. When Reaper came back, her expression was different, determined, almost fierce. "Doc," she'd said, "how many days until your eviction is final?" 7 days, Doc had answered. "Well, 6 now." Reaper had nodded. "Then in 6 days, you're going to see something." She'd pulled out a business card and pressed it into Doc's hand. "This is our lawyer. Call her tomorrow. Tell her Reaper sent you. Tell her everything you told us." Doc had looked at the card, confused. "I can't afford a lawyer." "You don't need to," Reaper had said. "She rides with the Desert Riders MC. She's also a former Army JAG officer who specializes in veterans' rights. And brother, what this town council is doing to you, that's not just wrong, that's illegal." The Iron Brotherhood had mounted their bikes after that, engines roaring to life. But before they left, Reaper had leaned close to Doc and said something he'd never forget. "You're not alone anymore. 6 days. Watch the highways." Then they'd ridden away, 15 bikes disappearing down Route 47 into the gathering dusk, leaving Doc sitting on the curb with an empty cooler and a business card, and the first spark of hope he'd felt in months. That night, something started building on the highways across 7 states. Phone calls were made, messages were sent, motorcycle clubs that had never ridden together began planning a journey. From Nevada, California, Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, Utah, and Oklahoma, bikers checked their bikes, packed their gear, and prepared to ride. The town council of Ridgemont, Arizona had no idea what was coming. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd solved their problem quietly and legally and permanently. They were wrong. Doc had called the lawyer the morning after the Iron Brotherhood left, half convinced nothing would come of it. The business card Reaper had given him listed Patricia Chen, attorney at law, with a Phoenix address and a phone number. When he dialed, expecting voicemail or a receptionist who'd tell him to call back later, Patricia herself had answered on the second ring. "Mr. Williams," she'd said before he could even introduce himself, "Reaper called me last night. Tell me everything." Doc had told his story again, sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the abandoned gas station, staring at the padlocked storage unit. Patricia had listened without interrupting, and he could hear her typing in the background, taking notes. When he finished, there was a pause. Then Patricia's voice came back sharp with controlled anger. "Mr. Williams, what they're doing to you is textbook selective enforcement and discrimination against a disabled veteran. The fact that they accelerated your eviction to coincide with a tourism evaluation is particularly damning. I'm taking your case pro bono. I need you to gather every document you have, every eviction notice, every citation, every email or letter from the town council. Can you do that?" Doc had done it. He'd spent the rest of that day tracking down copies of everything from the county clerk's office, from Mrs. Patterson at the library, from his own scattered records. He'd driven to Phoenix the next morning and sat in Patricia's office, a converted warehouse space where she practiced law when she wasn't riding with the Desert Riders MC. Her walls were covered with photographs of motorcycles and military commendations, a law degree from Stanford and a certificate from the Army JAG Corps. Patricia had reviewed his documents with the precision of someone who'd spent years prosecuting military cases. Then, she'd looked up at him and said, "We can fight this, but it's going to take time, and time is something you don't have. The eviction is in 5 days. Even with an emergency injunction, we're cutting it close." Doc had nodded, trying not to hope too much. "I understand. I appreciate you trying." Patricia had smiled then, a smile that reminded Doc of the officers he'd served under who'd actually cared about their troops. "Mr. Williams, I'm not just trying. Reaper called in some favors. The Iron Brotherhood is putting the word out. You're going to have support, more support than you can imagine." Doc hadn't understood what she meant, not then. The rumble started at dawn on Tuesday, the day the town council was scheduled to present their beautification award application to the State Tourism Board evaluators. Doc was parked in his truck on a side street 3 blocks from the abandoned gas station, trying to decide if he should even show up to watch his eviction become official. He'd been sleeping in the truck for the past 5 nights, parked in different spots around town, trying to stay invisible. The sound woke him. Low at first, distant, like thunder rolling in from the desert, but it didn't fade. It grew. Doc sat up confused and looked toward Route 47. Motorcycles, dozens of them, no, more than dozens. The sound was building, multiplying, becoming a wall of noise that echoed off the buildings and rattled windows. Doc started his truck and drove toward the sound, his heart pounding, not understanding what he was hearing. He turned onto Main Street and stopped. His hands went slack on the steering wheel. The first wave had already arrived. 50 motorcycles, maybe more, parked in perfect formation along both sides of Main Street. Riders in leather cuts stood beside their bikes, arms crossed, faces serious. Their patches identified them as the Silver State Riders from Nevada. They weren't blocking traffic, weren't breaking any laws, just standing there in complete silence. Then came the second wave. The rumble intensified, and Doc watched as more motorcycles poured into downtown Ridgemont from the west. 100 bikes this time, their chrome catching the early morning sun, their engines synchronized in a deep, powerful rhythm. They parked in formation behind the Silver State Riders, filling more of Main Street, extending down side streets. Their cuts identified them as multiple clubs from California: the Desert Riders, the Coastal Brotherhood, the Valley Vanguards, the Sacramento Steel. Doc got out of his truck, his prosthetic leg nearly giving out, and stood on the sidewalk watching in disbelief. People were coming out of their houses, out of the diner, out of the auto parts store, all of them staring at the growing army of bikers filling their town. The third wave came from the east. More motorcycles, these from Colorado and New Mexico. The Rocky Mountain Riders, the High Desert Brotherhood, the Iron Brotherhood, with Reaper at the front, spotting Doc and nodding in recognition. They parked in formation, engines cutting off one by one, leaving a ringing silence that somehow felt louder than the noise had been. Then came Texas, then Utah, then Oklahoma. By 7:30 in the morning, motorcycles filled every street in downtown Ridgemont. They lined Main Street, 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street. They filled the parking lots of the grocery store, the bank, the post office. They parked in front of the town hall, the police station, the library. Everywhere Doc looked, he saw leather cuts and chrome and American flags in patches that read, "Veterans, Riders, Brothers, Sisters." Doc stood in the middle of it all, tears streaming down his weathered face, unable to process what he was seeing. These people didn't know him. Most of them had never met him. But they'd ridden hundreds of miles, some of them thousands, because Reaper had made a phone call and said a veteran needed help. By 8 o'clock in the morning, when Doc finally thought to start counting, he reached 888 motorcycles before he lost track. 888 bikers stood in downtown Ridgemont, Arizona, completely silent, completely still, arms crossed, eyes forward. They weren't angry, weren't threatening, weren't breaking any laws. They were just there, present, undeniable. A physical reminder that some things mattered more than beautification awards and tourism dollars. News vans started arriving at 7:45. First from Flagstaff, then Phoenix, then Tucson. Reporters jumped out with cameras and microphones, trying to understand what was happening, interviewing bikers who answered in calm, measured voices. "We're here to support a veteran," they said. "We're here because the system failed him, and we don't let our brothers stand alone." The town council members started arriving at 8:15, preparing for their 9 o'clock presentation to the State Tourism Board evaluators. Councilman Brennan pulled up in his Cadillac and stopped short, staring at the wall of motorcycles blocking the street to Town Hall. He got out of his car slowly, his face going from confusion to fear to anger in rapid succession. "You can't be here," he'd shouted at the nearest group of bikers. "You're blocking public streets. This is illegal." A large biker with a gray beard and a cut identifying him as Hammer from the Colorado Steel had looked at Brennan with complete calm. "Sir, we're parked legally. We're not blocking traffic, just present. We have as much right to be on public streets as anyone else. This is harassment," Brennan had sputtered. "I'm calling the police," Hammer had shrugged. "You do what you need to do, sir." Brennan had stormed into Town Hall, pulling out his phone. 10 minutes later, the sheriff arrived with 3 deputies. Sheriff Martinez was a reasonable man, a veteran himself from the Gulf War, and Doc watched him walk slowly through the rows of parked motorcycles, studying the scene with a lawman's eye. The sheriff had found Reaper and several other road captains standing together near the front. "Are you folks planning any trouble?" he had asked. "No, sir," Reaper had answered. "We're exercising our First Amendment right to peaceful assembly. We're not blocking any roads, not threatening anyone, not breaking any laws. We're just here." Sheriff Martinez had nodded slowly. "How long are you planning to stay?" "As long as it takes," Reaper had said. The sheriff had looked around at the 888 bikers, all of them calm, all of them respectful, all of them absolutely immovable. Then he'd turned back to Reaper. "Where's Doc Williams?" Reaper had pointed, and the sheriff had walked over to where Doc stood near his truck, still crying, still unable to believe what was happening. "Doc," Sheriff Martinez had said gently, "these folks with you?" Doc had nodded, unable to speak. The sheriff had put a hand on Doc's shoulder. "Then I guess we're going to have an interesting morning." He looked back at the bikers and raised his voice. "Folks, I appreciate you keeping this peaceful. You're welcome in Ridgemont as long as you follow the law. But I want to be clear. Any trouble, any violence, any property damage, and this ends immediately. Understood. A chorus of "yes, sirs" had echoed back. At 8:45, Patricia Chen arrived, pulling up in a pickup truck with a Desert Rider's patch on her leather jacket. She'd brought 2 other lawyers with her, both veterans, both riding with clubs from Arizona and New Mexico. They'd set up a folding table on the sidewalk in front of Town Hall and started laying out documents, thick stacks of legal filings and evidence. Doc had walked over to her, still dazed. "What's happening?" he'd asked. "Justice, Mr. Williams," Patricia had said. "We filed emergency injunctions with the county court at 6 this morning. We're presenting evidence of selective enforcement, discrimination against a disabled veteran, and abuse of power by the town council. We've also filed complaints with the State Attorney General's office and contacted the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division." She'd looked up at him and smiled. "You're not fighting alone anymore." At 9 o'clock, 3 people in business suits arrived in a state vehicle marked Arizona Tourism Board. They were the evaluators coming to witness Ridgemont's Beautification Award presentation. They'd stopped at the edge of downtown and stared at the sea of motorcycles filling every street. One of them, a woman with gray hair and a clipboard, had walked up to the nearest biker. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" The biker, an older woman with a Vietnam veteran patch on her cut, had answered simply. "The town council tried to evict a homeless veteran who runs a soup kitchen, said he was bad for their image. We disagreed." The evaluator had written something on her clipboard, then kept walking, talking to more bikers, taking photographs, asking questions. Doc watched her face change from confusion to understanding, to something like anger, as she learned the full story. By 9:30, the evaluators had requested an emergency meeting with the town council before the official presentation. Doc couldn't hear what was said inside Town Hall, but he could see it through the windows. Councilman Brennan was red-faced and gesturing. The evaluators were shaking their heads. Other council members looked panicked. At 10 o'clock, Patricia Chen was called into Town Hall. She'd taken her stack of documents and walked inside with the confidence of someone who'd prosecuted war criminals and wasn't impressed by small-town bureaucrats. She was inside for 40 minutes. When she came back out, she'd walked straight to Doc. "The county judge issued a temporary restraining order against your eviction pending a full hearing. The town council has agreed to negotiate, and the State Tourism Board has suspended Ridgemont's Beautification Award application pending an investigation into the council's conduct." She'd smiled. "We won the first round." The bikers had stayed completely silent through all of it, but Doc heard the subtle shift in their stance, the slight relaxation, the quiet satisfaction of people who'd shown up for the right reasons and made a difference. More news crews arrived throughout the morning. The story was spreading. Homeless veteran serves bikers free meal. 800 bikers show up to save his soup kitchen. The footage showed the endless rows of motorcycles, the leather-clad veterans standing in solidarity, the town that had tried to hide its homeless population and instead became national news for all the wrong reasons. Councilman Brennan tried to give a statement to the press, tried to explain that this was all a misunderstanding, that the town had legitimate concerns about health and safety. But a reporter from Phoenix had done her homework and asked pointed questions about why other businesses with similar violations hadn't been shut down, why the eviction had been accelerated to coincide with the tourism evaluation, why a veteran who'd served his country was being treated like a criminal for feeding hungry people. Brennan had no good answers. He'd stuttered, turned red, and walked away from the cameras. By noon, 3 of the 5 town council members had quietly approached Patricia and asked what they needed to do to resolve this situation. Patricia had laid out her terms: permanent withdrawal of the eviction, a formal apology to Doc, assistance in bringing the soup kitchen up to Diana Vinui code properly with reasonable timelines and support, and a commitment to stop harassing the homeless population. The council members had looked at the 888 bikers still standing in their town, at the news cameras broadcasting their shame to the state, at the tourism board evaluators taking notes, and they'd agreed to everything. At 2 in the afternoon, the property owner's son, David Chen, showed up with bolt cutters and removed the padlock from the storage unit. "I'm sorry," he'd told Doc again. "My mother wants you to have a proper lease, $1 per year, in writing, legally protected. She's ashamed of what happened." Doc had shaken his hand, too overwhelmed to say much beyond thank you. The bikers stayed until 4 o'clock, when Patricia confirmed that all the legal documents were signed and filed. Then, Reaper had called for attention, and 888 bikers had gathered around as she'd presented Doc with a check. "Brother," she'd said, "this is from clubs across 7 states. Donations to help you rebuild and keep serving. It's not charity, it's respect." Doc had looked at the check and nearly collapsed. It was for $87,000. As the sun started to set, the bikers began to leave. Not all at once, but in waves, the same way they had arrived. They'd started their engines, the rumble building again, and they'd ridden out of Ridgemont in formation, heading back to Nevada and California and Colorado and Texas and New Mexico and Utah and Oklahoma. Back to their jobs and families and regular lives, having taken time off work and spent money on gas and hotels because a brother needed help. Each group that left had stopped by Doc to shake his hand, to thank him for his service, to tell him he mattered. By the time the last bike disappeared down Route 47, Doc was sitting on the curb outside his soup kitchen, surrounded by empty streets that still smelled like motorcycle exhaust, holding a check that would change everything, crying so hard he could barely breathe. Reaper had been the last to leave. She'd walked over to Doc and crouched down beside him. "You good, brother?" Doc had nodded, unable to speak. "You're not alone anymore," Reaper had said. "You got family now. All across this country, you got brothers and sisters who'll show up when you need them. Don't forget that." Then she'd mounted her bike and ridden away, and Doc had sat there in the gathering darkness, staring at the storage unit that was his again, at the check in his hands, at the town that had tried to erase him and failed because 888 bikers had decided that some promises were worth keeping. The legal machinery moved faster than Doc had ever seen government move in his entire life. Patricia Chen had explained it to him that evening after the bikers left, sitting across from him at a table in the town diner, while half of Ridgemont pretended not to stare at them. "The temporary restraining order's just the beginning," she'd said, spreading documents across the table. "We have a full hearing scheduled in 10 days before County Judge Roberts. She's a Navy veteran herself, served in the Gulf War, and she does not tolerate discrimination against disabled veterans. Based on the evidence we've presented, the improper acceleration of your eviction, the selective enforcement of codes, and the clear pattern of harassment, I'm confident we'll win a permanent injunction." Doc had stared at the legal documents, seeing words like plaintiff and defendant and discriminatory practice, barely able to process that he was the plaintiff, that he had rights, that the system he'd thought was stacked against him was suddenly, miraculously, working in his favor. "What do I need to do?" he'd asked. "Show up," Patricia had said. "Keep records of everything. And most importantly, don't give them any ammunition. Run your kitchen properly, follow every rule to the letter, and let me handle the legal fight." The State Tourism Board didn't waste time either. Within 24 hours of the biker arrival, they'd issued a press release announcing an immediate investigation into Ridgemont's Beautification Award application. The statement was carefully worded but devastating in its implications. It cited concerns about community values, treatment of vulnerable populations, and whether the town's beautification efforts represented genuine improvement or merely cosmetic concealment of systemic issues. The press release had been picked up by every major news outlet in Arizona. The story had everything: a homeless veteran, a heartless town council, a dramatic biker rescue, and a state government agency willing to hold local officials accountable. By Wednesday morning, the story had gone national. CNN ran a segment. NPR did an interview with Reaper. The Associated Press sent a reporter to Ridgemont who spent 2 days documenting Doc's story and talking to the people he'd been feeding. The town council tried damage control, but it was too late. Councilman Brennan held a press conference where he insisted the eviction had been about legitimate health and safety concerns, not discrimination. A reporter had immediately asked why Doc's Kitchen was the only food service operation in town that had been subjected to such aggressive enforcement. Brennan had stammered something about limited resources and enforcement priorities. Another reporter had asked about the decision to accelerate the eviction to coincide with the tourism evaluation. Brennan had said no comment and walked away from the podium. The video of that press conference went viral. Within 48 hours, Brennan's auto parts store was facing protests and calls for a boycott. His Yelp page was flooded with one-star reviews. His business partners were quietly distancing themselves. On Friday afternoon, 4 days after the bikers arrived, Brennan announced his resignation from the town council, citing personal reasons and a desire to focus on his business. He was the first, but not the last. Councilwoman Sandra Mitchell resigned on Saturday, releasing a brief statement that expressed regret for her votes regarding the soup kitchen and acknowledged that she'd allowed fear of economic consequences to override her moral obligations. Councilman Jorge Santos resigned on Monday with a longer statement that explicitly apologized to Doc and admitted that the council had acted improperly in targeting his operation while ignoring similar violations elsewhere. 3 of 5 council members gone in a week. The remaining 2, both of whom had been the quietest voices in the meetings, suddenly found themselves in charge of a town council that had become a national embarrassment. They scheduled an emergency meeting and invited Doc to attend. Doc had walked into that meeting with Patricia beside him and a room full of reporters in the back. The remaining council members, Helen Park and Michael Thompson, had looked exhausted and ashamed. They'd formally withdrawn the eviction action, apologized on behalf of the town, and asked Doc what they could do to make things right. Patricia had handed them a list. It included formal withdrawal of all citations against the soup kitchen, commitment to work cooperatively with Doc to bring the facility up to code with reasonable timelines and financial assistance, a town resolution honoring Doc's service, both military and civilian, and a public commitment to stop harassment of the homeless population. The council had agreed to everything without debate. The vote was 2-0, with 3 vacant seats on the dais, serving as a reminder of what happened when elected officials forgot who they were supposed to serve. But it wasn't just the council that faced consequences. Martinez Brothers Foods, the supplier that had dropped Doc under pressure, found itself on the wrong end of a very public boycott. Veterans organizations across Arizona had put out the word, "Don't do business with companies that abandon veterans." Martinez's phones had rung constantly with cancellations. His biggest client, a restaurant chain with locations across the Southwest, had quietly ended their contract. His suppliers had started asking for payment up front instead of extending credit. Old man Martinez had called Doc on Thursday, his voice rough with emotion and what might have been tears. "Doc, I was wrong," he'd said. "I was a coward. I let them scare me into abandoning you, and I've regretted it every day since. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for a chance to make it right." Doc had listened, remembering that Martinez had helped him for months before the pressure became too much, remembering that fear made people do things they weren't proud of. "What do you need?" Doc had asked. "Let me supply your kitchen again," Martinez had said. "No charge, for a year. Full service, everything you need, delivered twice a week. And after that, wholesale prices forever, guaranteed in writing." "Please, Doc, let me prove I'm not the man I was last week." Doc had looked at Patricia, who'd nodded slightly. "Okay," Doc had said, "but I want it in writing, and I want you to donate to the food bank and Flagstaff, too. Help other people who are trying to feed hungry folks." "Done," Martinez had said immediately. "All of it." "Thank you, Doc. Thank you for being a better man than I was." The health department inspection happened on Friday, exactly 1 week after the bikers arrived. This time it was different. This time, the inspector came with a checklist and a helpful attitude instead of a clipboard and a scowl. The inspector was a middle-aged woman named Gloria Ramirez, who'd worked for the health department for 20 years and had been horrified to learn how her department had been used as a weapon against a veteran. "Mr. Williams," she'd said, "I want to apologize. I wasn't the inspector who handled your case, but I work for the same department, and I'm ashamed of how you were treated. Today, we're going to do a real inspection. We're going to identify what genuinely needs to be fixed for health and safety, and then we're going to help you fix it, not shut you down, help you." She'd spent 3 hours going through the storage unit, taking notes, measuring, checking temperatures, examining surfaces. When she finished, she'd sat down with Doc and Patricia and gone through her findings point by point. "You need a 3-compartment sink for proper dishwashing," she'd said. "You need separate food storage areas. You need better ventilation. You need a hand-washing station that meets code. These are real requirements, and they're for good reasons. but they're all fixable, and I'm going to work with you to make sure you can afford to fix them. The health department, under intense media scrutiny and pressure from the state, had suddenly discovered a grant program for small food service operations serving vulnerable populations. They'd approved Doc's application within 48 hours. $15,000 to bring his facility up to code, no strings attached, no requirements beyond meeting legitimate health standards. Patricia had made sure everything was documented, every inspection report, every piece of correspondence, every approval, everything went into a file that would protect Doc if anyone ever tried to target him again. She had also helped him incorporate as a nonprofit, file for tax-exempt status, and set up proper insurance. "You're not just running a soup kitchen anymore," she'd told him. "You're running an organization. That means paperwork, but it also means protection." The property lease had been formalized by Mrs. Chen's lawyer. $1 per year for 10 years, with an option to renew. The lease explicitly permitted food service operations and included clauses protecting Doc from arbitrary eviction. David Chen had driven down from Tucson to apologize in person and present Doc with the signed lease. "My mother wanted you to know," David had said, "that she's proud to have you on her property. She said her son would have been proud too." By the end of the second week, Doc's Soup Kitchen had legal protection, a solid lease, a reliable food supplier, $15,000 in grant money for improvements, and a checking account with $87,000 from the bikers' donation. He'd gone from having nothing, from sitting on a curb with a padlocked storage unit, to having more resources than he'd ever imagined. But the changes weren't just practical. They were personal, too. The people who'd stopped coming during those dark days started returning. Maria, the 73-year-old woman living on $400 a month, showed up on Tuesday morning with tears in her eyes. "I was so afraid," she told Doc. "Those men in uniform scared me. But I saw you on the news, saw those bikers standing up for you, and I thought, if Doc is brave enough to keep going, I should be brave enough to come back." Tommy, the 19-year-old construction worker sleeping in his car, had shown up on Wednesday, brought 6 of his co-workers with him. They'd eaten dinner, then stayed to help Doc clean up. "You fed me when I was hungry," Tommy had said. "Let me pay it forward." The Johnson family came back. Other families Doc had never met started showing up, having seen the news coverage, and learned that Ridgemont had a place where hungry people could eat with dignity. By the end of the week, Doc was serving 50 people a day. By the end of the month, it was 60. The churches started helping again. The Baptist church ladies returned with apologies and casseroles. The Methodist church donated a commercial refrigerator they'd been storing in their basement. The Catholic church, which had never responded to Doc's calls before, showed up with a check for $5,000 and a promise of monthly support. "We should have been there from the beginning," the priest had said. "We're here now." The town itself changed. Not everyone, not overnight, but enough to matter. Mrs. Patterson from the library started organizing donation drives. The high school started sending student volunteers. The grocery store manager, who'd stopped donating after the council pressure, called Doc personally to apologize and offer regular donations of unsaleable but still good food. Even the diner owner, who'd been neutral during the whole conflict, started sending over leftover soup and bread at the end of each day. Ridgemont was learning, slowly and painfully, that you couldn't beautify a town by hiding its hungry people. Real beauty came from how you treated the most vulnerable among you. Real community came from showing up for each other, not pushing each other away. On the last Friday of the month, exactly 4 weeks after the bikers had arrived, the town held a ceremony. Not for a beautification award, which had been permanently withdrawn, but to present Doc with a formal commendation from the mayor and what remained of the town council. They'd tried to make it a big production, but Doc had requested something simple, just a brief acknowledgement at the regular council meeting. The council chambers were packed anyway. Veterans organizations sent representatives. The Bikers Club sent delegations, including Reaper, who'd ridden back from New Mexico specifically for the occasion. The people Doc served showed up, filling the back rows, many of them wearing their nicest clothes, all of them wanting to witness the moment when their town officially recognized that Doc mattered. Helen Park, now serving as interim council president, had read the commendation aloud. Whereas Marcus Williams served his country with honor in Vietnam, earning a Purple Heart and our eternal gratitude, and whereas he has continued to serve his community by operating a soup kitchen that provides meals and dignity to our most vulnerable neighbors, and whereas his selfless service represents the highest ideals of compassion and community, the town of Ridgemont hereby recognizes Marcus Williams as an exemplary citizen and thanks him for his continued service. It was just words on paper, but Doc had stood there crying anyway, because words mattered when they came from people who'd spent months trying to erase you. Because recognition mattered when you'd been invisible for so long. Because sometimes the system did work, eventually, if enough people decided it should. After the ceremony, Doc had walked back to his soup kitchen, to the storage unit that was legally his now, to the space that had been padlocked and was now open, to the place where he'd made a promise to serve anyone who showed up hungry. He'd stood there, in the doorway, looking at the improvements he'd already started making with the grant money, at the new 3-compartment sink being installed next week, at the proper food storage shelves, at the ventilation system being upgraded to code. It wasn't just a soup kitchen anymore. It was proof that sometimes, when you stand up for what's right, when you serve others even when you have nothing, when you keep your promises even when the system tries to break them, people notice. And sometimes, if you're lucky, those people show up. 888 of them on motorcycles, making enough noise that no one could ignore you anymore, refusing to let you stand alone. Doc had made it through the eviction, through the legal battles, through the council resignations and the investigations and the national news coverage. He'd won his kitchen back, won his dignity back, won recognition from the town that had tried to erase him. He had a lease, a grant, a donation account with more money than he'd ever seen, and a community that was finally, slowly, learning to see him not as a problem, but as a neighbor worth supporting. He'd survived. More than that, he'd won. And now came the hardest part, figuring out what to do, with victory, how to build something lasting from the ruins of what had almost been lost, how to turn a moment of justice into a lifetime of service. Doc stood in his doorway and smiled, his prosthetic leg aching, his hands still shaking slightly, his heart full for the first time in years. He had work to do, people to feed, promises to keep, and this time, he wouldn't be doing it alone. Doc thought winning the legal battle was the end of the story. He was wrong. It was just the beginning. The first sign came 3 days after the town council ceremony, when a pickup truck pulled into the abandoned gas station parking lot. The driver was a man in his 50s with a weathered face and a ball cap that read Anderson Construction. He had introduced himself as Mike Anderson, owner of a veteran-owned construction company out of Phoenix, and he'd come with blueprints. Mr. Williams, he'd said, spreading the plans across the hood of his truck, I saw what happened here on the news. I'm a Gulf War vet myself, and what those bikers did, showing up like that, it reminded me that we're supposed to take care of each other. So I talked to some other veteran contractors I know, and we want to help you build something proper. Not just fix code violations, but create a real commercial kitchen that can serve hundreds of people a day and last for decades. Doc had stared at the blueprints, seeing a transformed space with professional equipment, proper ventilation, storage areas, serving lines, even a small dining area with tables. This must cost, he'd started to say. Anderson had held up his hand. Labor is free. Every contractor involved is either a veteran or employs veterans, and we're all donating our time. We just need you to cover materials, and with that grant money and the donations from the bikers, you can afford it. We can start next week if you approve the plans. Doc had approved them through tears he didn't bother hiding. The construction started on Monday morning. Anderson brought a crew of 8, all veterans from different branches and different wars. They worked with the efficiency of people who'd built things under fire and knew how to get a job done right. They tore out walls, installed proper plumbing, ran new electrical lines, built storage shelves, and transformed the storage unit into something that looked like an actual commercial kitchen instead of a converted shed. Other contractors showed up throughout the week. An electrician from Tucson who'd served in Afghanistan donated and installed commercial-grade lighting and outlets. A plumber from Flagstaff who'd been Navy ran proper drain lines and installed the 3-compartment sink required by health code. An HVAC specialist from Phoenix installed a ventilation system that exceeded code requirements. While construction was happening, Reaper called Doc with more news. "Brother," she'd said, "the clubs have been talking. We want to do more than just save your kitchen. We want to help you build something sustainable, something that will last long after we all ride our last mile. We're organizing a national fundraiser, biker rallies across 7 states, all the proceeds going to you. We're calling it the Roadside Angels Fund," Doc had protested. "You already gave me $87,000. That's more than enough," Reaper had laughed. "Doc, that money was for emergency legal costs and immediate needs. This is different. This is for building something that will serve your community for years to come. Trust us. Let us do this." The fundraisers happened throughout November and December. Motorcycle rallies in Nevada, California, Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, Utah, and Oklahoma. Poker runs, charity rides, benefit concerts, auction events. The bikers mobilized their networks, reaching out to veteran organizations, motorcycle clubs, businesses, and individual donors. The story of Doc and his soup kitchen had touched something in people, reminded them that service didn't end when you took off the uniform, that communities were built by people who showed up for each other. By mid-December, the Roadside Angels Fund had raised $143,000. Combined with Doc's original donation, he suddenly had resources that seemed impossible. Patricia Chen helped him establish Roadside Angels as a formal nonprofit organization with Doc as executive director. They filed all the paperwork, got their tax-exempt status approved, opened a proper business account, and set up a board of directors that included Reaper, Patricia, Mike Anderson, Sheriff Martinez, and Mrs. Patterson from the library. "You're not just running a soup kitchen anymore," Patricia had told him during their first board meeting. "You're running an organization that can make a real difference. That means thinking bigger than just daily meals. What else does your community need?" Doc had thought about all the people he'd served over the past 18 months. Thought about Tommy sleeping in his car, about Maria living on $400 a month, about the Johnson family choosing between food and rent. He'd thought about his own 7 years of homelessness, the things that had helped him and the things that had been missing. "Job training," he'd said. "Most of the folks I serve want to work, but they don't have the skills or connections. And addiction counseling referrals. A lot of people are struggling with substances, and they need help but don't know where to start. And maybe a veteran support group, because there are a lot of guys like me carrying around wars that ended decades ago." By January, Roadside Angels wasn't just a soup kitchen anymore. It was a community center. Doc used part of the donated funds to hire 2 staff members, both homeless veterans he'd been serving for months. James Rodriguez was a 38-year-old Army veteran who'd been sleeping behind the grocery store, struggling with PTSD and alcoholism. Sarah Mitchell was a 41-year-old Marine veteran who'd been living in her car with her teenage daughter, trying to save enough money for an apartment deposit while working part-time at a gas station. Doc hired them both at $15 an hour to help run the kitchen and coordinate services. It gave them steady income, purpose, and a path forward. James found an apartment within a month. Sarah and her daughter moved into a small rental house within 6 weeks. Both of them worked with the dedication of people who understood exactly what it meant to be hungry and desperate and helped by someone who cared. The bikers kept showing up, but not in waves of hundreds anymore. Instead, they created a rotating volunteer schedule. Each month, a different motorcycle club would take responsibility for sending volunteers to help serve meals, maintain the facility, and support programs. January was the Iron Brotherhood from New Mexico. February was the Desert Riders from Arizona. March was the Silver State Riders from Nevada. The schedule extended through the entire year, with clubs from 7 states committing to monthly service. When the clubs showed up, they didn't just serve food. They brought skills and resources, construction experience, mechanical knowledge, financial planning expertise, counseling backgrounds, job connections. The bikers became mentors, friends, advocates. They showed up consistently, proving that the day they'd filled Ridgemont streets wasn't a one-time spectacle, but the beginning of a sustained commitment. Doc started the job training program in February, partnering with the community college in Flagstaff to offer free classes in food service, construction basics, and customer service. The classes were held twice a week at Roadside Angels, with transportation provided for anyone who needed it. 15 people enrolled in the first session. By March, it was 23. The addiction counseling referrals started in March. Doc couldn't afford to hire a full-time counselor, but he partnered with a treatment center in Phoenix that sent someone once a week to meet with anyone who wanted help. The counselor, a woman named Jennifer Lopez, who'd been in recovery herself for 12 years, held confidential sessions in a small office space that Mike Anderson's crew had built into the renovated facility. She connected people with treatment programs, support groups, and resources. Not everyone was ready to accept help, but for those who were, the door was open. The Veterans Support Group started meeting on Thursday evenings in April. Doc facilitated it himself, sitting in a circle with other veterans who carried invisible wounds from visible wars. They talked about nightmares and survivor's guilt and the struggle to adjust to civilian life. They talked about feeling invisible, forgotten, discarded by the country they'd served. And they talked about hope, about healing, about finding purpose after trauma. The group started with 5 veterans. By May, it was 12. By June, it was 18. Some were from Ridgemont, but others drove from surrounding towns, having heard about the safe space where you could talk without judgment, where everyone understood because everyone had been there. The transformation wasn't just happening inside Roadside Angels, it was spreading through the community. The high school started sending student volunteers regularly, teaching teenagers about service and compassion. Local businesses began donating goods and services without being asked. The churches coordinated their support, each taking responsibility for different needs: food donations, clothing drives, furniture for people moving into apartments, school supplies for kids. Ridgemont was becoming the kind of community it had pretended to be when applying for that beautification award. Not perfect, not without problems, but genuinely trying to care for all its residents, not just the ones who looked good in tourism brochures. By May, Doc was serving 90 people a day. The facility could handle it now, with professional equipment and trained staff. The meals were better too, more nutritious, more varied, prepared in a kitchen that met every health code and exceeded most of them. Doc still made the sandwiches sometimes, still greeted people at the door, still made sure everyone felt welcome and valued. But he wasn't alone anymore. He had James and Sarah, he had the rotating biker volunteers, he had a community that had learned to show up. The 6-month anniversary of the biker arrival fell on a Saturday in late April. The town council, now expanded back to 5 members with 3 new faces elected in a special election, decided to hold a ceremony. Not to present Doc with another commendation, but to officially recognize what Roadside Angels had become and what it meant for the community. They'd planned a small event at Town Hall, maybe 50 people, some speeches, a plaque presentation. What they got was something entirely different. The rumble started at dawn, just like it had 6 months earlier. Doc was at Roadside Angels preparing for the day's breakfast service when he heard it, that unmistakable sound of motorcycle engines multiplying, building, becoming a wall of noise that echoed across town. He'd walked outside and started crying before he even saw them. They came from all directions: the Iron Brotherhood from New Mexico, the Desert Riders from Arizona, the Silver State Riders from Nevada, the California clubs, the Colorado clubs, the Texas clubs, the Utah clubs, the Oklahoma clubs. They came in formation, engines synchronized, filling the streets of Ridgemont just like they had 6 months ago. But this time was different. This time, they weren't there to intimidate or force change. They were there to celebrate. 888 motorcycles filled downtown Ridgemont again, but this time, the town council stood with them, welcomed them, thanked them. This time, the business owners came out to shake hands and offer free coffee and breakfast. This time, the residents lined the streets cheering instead of staring in fear. The ceremony was moved from Town Hall to the parking lot of Roadside Angels, where everyone could fit. A makeshift stage was set up. Chairs were arranged for elderly attendees. The rest stood, hundreds of people mixing together, bikers in leather cuts, town residents in their Saturday clothes, homeless folks in whatever they had, veterans in service organization caps, students in school colors, all of them there to witness something important. Mayor Helen Park, who'd been one of the 2 council members who stayed after the resignations, spoke first. 6 months ago, she'd said, this town learned a painful lesson about what really matters. We learned that beauty isn't about hiding problems, it's about solving them. We learned that community isn't about appearance, it's about action. And we learned that sometimes it takes 888 bikers to remind us of truths we should never have forgotten. She'd presented Doc with a key to the city, a symbolic gesture that once would have felt empty but now felt genuine. This key represents our gratitude, she'd said, not just for feeding hungry people, but for teaching us what service really means. Reaper spoke next, standing on stage in her road captain cut, looking out at the crowd. We showed up 6 months ago because a veteran needed help, and we don't let our brothers stand alone, she'd said. We're here today because Doc didn't just accept help, he multiplied it. He took what we gave him and built something bigger than any of us imagined. That's what service looks like. That's what brotherhood means. And that's why we'll keep showing up, not just for Doc, but for every veteran, every hungry person, every forgotten soul who needs someone to prove they matter. Doc was called to the stage last. He'd stood there looking out at the crowd, at the 888 motorcycles, at the faces of people he'd served and people who'd served him, at the community that had tried to erase him and then learned to embrace him. He'd reached into his pocket and pulled out his father's Purple Heart, the one that had been locked in the storage unit 6 months ago, the one he'd recovered when the padlock came off. He'd held it up, and the crowd had gone completely silent. My father earned this in World War II, Doc had said, his voice shaking. He gave it to me before he died, and told me it wasn't about the medal, it was about what it represented. Service, sacrifice, showing up for something bigger than yourself. I wore a uniform for 4 years and earned my own medals, but I never understood what my father meant until I started serving meals to hungry people. That's when I learned that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It's about showing up every day and doing what needs to be done, even when nobody's watching, even when nobody cares. He'd pinned the Purple Heart to his shirt, tears streaming down his weathered face. 6 months ago, I was alone, beaten, about to lose everything. And then 15 bikers showed up and accepted sandwiches from a homeless veteran, and one of them made a phone call. And then 888 of you showed up and changed everything. You didn't just save my kitchen, you saved me. You reminded me that I'm not alone, that none of us are alone, that we're all part of something bigger. Brothers and sisters who show up when we're needed, who stand together against injustice, who prove every day that service and sacrifice and compassion still matter. He'd looked directly at Reaper then. I thought you came to give me justice, Doc had said, but you gave me something more. You gave me family. You gave me purpose. You showed me that no veteran fights alone, and I promise you, I promise all of you, that as long as I have breath in my body, I will honor that gift by serving anyone who shows up hungry, anyone who needs help, anyone who's been forgotten by the systems that should protect them. That's my mission now. That's what Roadside Angels is for. And that's what I'll do until my last day. The crowd had erupted in applause that lasted for minutes. Bikers had revved their engines in salute. People had stood and cheered. And Doc had stood there on that makeshift stage, surrounded by brothers and sisters in leather, holding his father's Purple Heart against his chest, finally understanding what the old man had meant all those years ago. Service wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about showing up, about doing what needed to be done, about being the person someone else needed, even when you had nothing to give but your presence and your promise. It was about creating family from strangers, building community from chaos, and proving that dignity and compassion and justice weren't just words, but actions you took every single day. After the ceremony, the bikers stayed for hours. They toured Roadside Angels, seeing the transformed facility, meeting James and Sarah, talking with the people who came for meals. They donated more money, offered more help, made more promises to keep showing up. They weren't just supporters anymore. They were part of something permanent, something lasting, something that would continue long after the engines fell silent and the leather cuts were hung up for the last time. As the sun set and the bikers began to leave, riding out in the same formation they'd arrived in, Doc stood in the doorway of Roadside Angels, watching them go. 888 motorcycles disappearing down Route 47, heading home to 7 different states, back to their regular lives until the next time a veteran needed help and someone made a phone call. Doc turned back to his kitchen, his community center, his life's purpose. There was work to do tomorrow, meals to serve, classes to teach, people to help, promises to keep. He had James and Sarah and a rotating schedule of volunteers. He had resources and legal protection and a community that finally understood. He had family scattered across 7 states who'd proven they would show up when it mattered. Most importantly, he had proof that service mattered, that showing up mattered, that one person with nothing could still make a difference if they just refused to give up. He'd served 15 bikers a free meal when he had nothing left to give, and they'd responded by bringing 888 more. They'd shown him that no act of kindness was wasted, that compassion multiplied when shared, that the promise to never let a veteran stand alone wasn't just words, but a commitment backed by action. Doc locked up Roadside Angels that night, patted the Purple Heart still pinned to his shirt, and drove his old truck to the apartment he could finally afford. He'd survived homelessness, survived bureaucratic cruelty, survived almost losing everything. More than survived, he'd won. And tomorrow he'd wake up and do it again, serving meals to hungry people, helping veterans find their way, building community one person at a time. Because that's what Doc did. That's who he was. A Marine Corps medic who'd never stopped serving, a homeless veteran who'd never stopped caring, a brother in leather who'd learned that family wasn't about blood, it was about showing up. And as long as he had breath in his body, he'd keep showing up, keep serving, keep proving that some promises were worth keeping forever. No veteran fights alone. 888 bikers had taught him that. Now he'd spend the rest of his life teaching others, one meal, one conversation, one act of service at a time.